Hello, good evening and welcome to tonight's Festival of Debate event. I'm Sara Hill, I'm a co-founder of Opus and the festival, and I'll be chairing for the evening. Tonight's event is part of the 2021 Festival of Debate, an annual programme coordinated by the social enterprise Opus Independence, which brings people together to share new ideas that can help shape our understanding of the world. This year's programme is Pay What You Feel, to try and ensure that all of our events are as accessible as possible. However, that does mean, of course, we do rely on audience donations. So if you are able to donate, please visit festivalofdebate.com. The festival team will be monitoring the chat. We'd like to ask all audience members to be respectful of others, and we'll remove anyone from our events who does not follow our Safer Festivals policy, which is available on our website. If you'd like to ask any questions tonight, and please ask questions tonight, use the Q&A function and we will get to as many as we can in the last part of tonight's live stream. We're going to be joined tonight by Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece, current professor of economic theory at the University of Athens, amongst many other accolades. And we're going to be discussing his latest book, Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present. The sci-fi novel imagines a not too distant future where a tear between realities allows our three protagonists to communicate with a parallel dimension, which had a very different reaction to the 2008 economic crash than our own did. And it goes on to describe how they changed their world in the wake of that crisis. If you haven't read the book, this is your first, final, and only warning that there will be spoilers ahead. However, there's no way in the short time that we have, we can possibly cover all of the ideas contained within its pages. So I absolutely encourage you to get yourself a copy from your favorite local independent tax-paying retailer, and I'm sure you won't regret it. So Yanis, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for the invitation, for setting this whole thing up. I have very fond memories of Sheffield. The last time I was there in situ. I hope to be back in the not too distant, but thank you anyway.
Yes, well, I'm sure we all share that hope. Let's jump straight in with a question. Why was now the time to write this book for you?
It's a personal choice. I think it has to do with the fact that I was staring at my 60th birthday, and as a person that started his political life at a very early stage, at a very early age, as a result of events here in Greece, with the fascist dictatorship that I lived through, I felt that I had come to answer the question that I always dodged. Like, all good socialists, we always dodge the question, mate, if you don't like capitalism, what is the alternative? And, the answer that we want the NHS and that we want justice and fairness for all simply doesn't cut it. Because, these are all very important issues, but they do not address the main question. If you don't want to live in a world in which the capital-labor relations is central, what do you replace that capital-labor relationship with? How do corporations function? Who prints the money? What about banking? What about land? Who owns the land? What about real estate? These are questions that, we socialists have always avoided answering. Even, Karl Marx, if you think about it, he spent all his life writing about as a communist, but never spoke about communism, not once. He always, concentrated on discussing capitalism. So I thought it was, actually my wife, about 15 years ago, said to me in no uncertain terms that I'm a hypocrite because, I keep criticizing the system and I dodge the question of what should replace it. And at some point I felt, I've been analyzing capitalism, struggling against capitalism in my professional life, in my political life. Time to put my money where my mouth was. So I sat down and I wrote another now, for better or for worse.
Well, congratulations on grasping that bull by the horns, because you're right. It's a very fair criticism of the left and socialists in general that we avoid asking that, well, what's the alternative question? I think like another quite fair criticism of the left's and socialism and so on in general that I thought of often when I was reading was the infighting and that inability to kind of come together and unify. And I wonder, did you intend or do you hope that this book is something that people can rally around?
Always, of course, the unity is so important, and having a conversation and stop this demonization of one another, not only within the left, but amongst decent people. The extent to which we have fragmented into bubbles that are self-referential and we don't talk to one another. But that was, of course, this is not just now with social media and so on. I remember when I was growing up, the left resembled so vividly that scene in Monty Python, when, the Judean People's Front, people are sitting in one part of the stadium and they hate the Liberation Front of Judean, and they are all united by one thing, the hatred for each other. And ignoring the Roman conquerors. This is what the left has always been. So, and Sara, let me say that the reason why I wrote it as a novel was not just that everybody is a frustrated novelist and we all have a novel in us that we want to bring out at some point. That's one reason, but it's not the only reason. It's not the main reason. The main reason is that, when I'm writing books and treatises and papers and this and that and the other articles on capitalism, I can easily sit down and say, this is how I think capitalism works. This is how I think capitalism fails, X, Y, Z. But when it comes to discussing what socialism, what the good society should look like, I can't do that because I disagree with myself. I say one thing and then after 5 minutes later, I think, hang on a second, no, this is going to lead to authoritarianism. This is going to lead to the concentration of power with this group, that institution, and so on. But the novel allows you to populate it with characters, each one of having a separate perspective, bringing a different perspective. And at some point, while writing this, I have a neoliberal, former banker, academic, economist in the book called Eva. I have a Marxist feminist, old-style lefty, Iris. I have a techie, Costa, and so on. And each one of them brings a different perspective to the discussion of what society should be like, what it is like, and what we must do in order to go from where we are to where we might agree we want to go to. And the conversations between them, the clashes between them, allowed me not to say, okay, this is how things are going to work. And therefore to include more people in the conversation. I put in there, because of the novel structure, views that are not necessarily mine, but which I think are legitimate. And part of me accepts them, but I wouldn't be able to advocate them as if this was my thesis. So that's the reason, really, for the novel.
Yeah, and I really recognize what you're saying there about those conversations that you have inside yourself and disagreeing with yourself and struggling to write it. I definitely felt whilst I was reading the discussions between the characters that it was echoing some of the stuff that I say to myself and go round and round. And I love the choice to make it a science fiction novel. Actually, one of my favorite quotes comes relatively early on, but actually speaks to that. And it's that capitalism and science fiction share one thing: they trade in future assets using fictitious currency. And I love that. It crystallized it so well for me. And one of the kind of key foundational first ideas of the Other Now is, of course, the one share, one vote, which in one stroke, it eliminates stock markets and that mechanism of seemingly infinite imaginary wealth creation, which we've seen go into overdrive during the COVID crisis, looking at the wealth increases of people like Jeff Bezos. And so I wonder, can you expand a little bit on this and why it was so essential to you to remove that mechanism in The Other Now?
The main driver of 20th century capitalism, of capitalism after the second industrial revolution, with the large monopolistic, vertically integrated firms like, Henry Ford's empire or Thomas Edison. These were the first networked firms. We moved away completely as a result of electromagnetism, as a result of, the Edison company that produced everything from the power generating station, the grid, the electric light bulb, the oven, everything. Yeah, that company is not at all connected to the original defense of capitalism by people like Adam Smith, who's talking about the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, right? We're moving into a state within a state. It was Thomas Edison in the 1900s. It is Jeff Bezos now. So the main driver for the mega firm on the one hand and the mega bank on the other hand, which creates something much closer to what I call techno-feudalism rather than the capitalism that Adam Smith was waxing lyrical about, which is based on the idea of a market town, which has of course been completely devastated by capitalism, really existing capitalism, which is closer, as I said, to techno-feudalism. To understand what drives this beast, it allows it to produce remarkable things like, iPhones and, SpaceX, landing a spaceship the other day, right? Elon Musk. While at the same time creating mass industrial scale depravity and hopelessness. And this is the contradiction of the system. Well, to understand that, you've got to understand how the stock exchanges work, how the financial markets work, and the foundation of financial markets on which you have the whole edifice of financialization and the banking sector and the derivatives markets and so on, being founded, is the very strange idea of share ownership. Because, if you and I were to form a small firm, double glazing or a cafeteria in Sheffield, okay, that makes sense. We're together. You own 50% of the business. I own 50% of the business. But the idea that you have a conglomerate, which is larger than many states, whose ownership, whose property rights are chopped up in tiny little pieces of paper. These days, it's not even paper. It's strings of zeros and ones. And that these pieces of paper or sets of zeros and ones become commodities that are traded anonymously in some market. And each one of them gives you a vote in the General Assembly of the shareholders of Amazon or of, General Dynamics or whatever, or, the Royal Bank of Scotland. And you can buy as many votes as you want. And when you buy them, effectively you control the universe. Because let's face it, all the important decisions are not made in the Houses of Parliament. They're not made in Congress. They're not made in the National Assembly of France. The most important decisions are made inside the boards of directors that are elected by the shareholders. So the idea that somebody can buy these shares, have effectively monopoly over states within states, and which, of course, it's not a new idea. It started with the British India Company, right? Which very soon after its creation, after 1599, if I remember correctly, they had an army larger than that of England. They had 200,000 soldiers. This is how they colonized India. So we always knew that share ownership, anonymous, freely traded shares, being the foundation of the new society, of modern society, of capitalist society. We always knew this was going to take us down the road of techno-feudalism. And we take it for granted. Nobody, very, very few people challenged this idea of anonymous shares that are being traded like confetti, like hotcakes in digitized global markets. So back to the original question, what is the alternative to this capitalism? Well, it must be a system where the ownership of these enterprises is democratized. And in the same way that in the political sphere, if anybody were to suggest to you that we should have a secondary market for votes, and people should be able to trade their votes and to sell their votes formally, officially, and without any shame or without hiding from the police. You'd say, you must be crazy. You might as well have a dictatorship. And yet, when it comes to the votes that really matter, this goes unchallenged. So the only alternative to what we have, the only serious alternative to what we have, is a situation where shares become like library cards in a university or in a public library. You get one once you enroll. You cannot trade it. You cannot rent it. You cannot hire it. You can use it. It gives you certain rights while you have it. If you leave the area, you leave the university, if you go to another municipality and you join another public library, you give it back and somebody else gets it. And then suddenly you think, my goodness, that would mean that everybody in the firm, you still have a firm that operates in markets, but everybody from the cleaner all the way to the CEO has one vote. And what's wrong with that? And then you start discovering all the benefits of that within the company and without the company. Because the moment you end share trading, suddenly what will banks do? Because, let's face it, Barclays and the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds and so on, they're not really in the business of giving you a current account and allowing you to make payments. They make some money out of this. But 90% of what the banks do is to create huge quantities of loans out of thin air, money that doesn't exist, the fictitious capital that you mentioned before, and placing it at the disposal of people out there, of a very small minority, who make bets on shares and on derivatives of shares and derivatives of derivatives. So this one stroke, changing corporate law and saying that companies must have shares that are distributed equally amongst anybody who works there. That would change everything overnight. So in my book, I start from that and say, imagine that were to happen. What happens next? And how would this work? And how would the other work? And what about money? And what happens to the banks? And do we need banks? Why can't the central bank give each one of us a digital bank account? What's the point of having banks if share markets have gone? And what happens with investment? How do savings turn into investments? What kind of loan market will they be? So, that's how I built up the whole scenario for my post-capitalist vision that supposedly emerged in that other now.
Well, talking of getting rid of the banks, that was exactly what I wanted to pick up on. You mentioned mega corporations and mega banks, and one of your other kind of foundation ideas from the other now is, of course, the per cap accounts and the 3 funds that go into them, and how that effectively overnight makes private banking irrelevant. I got very excited by this idea, and I know there's been kind of some comparison in the media with this idea and the idea of universal basic income, which I understand you're not necessarily a supporter of, and they are quite different. So I was wondering if you could just kind of just point out the key differences and why you felt those differences were necessary.
Well, let me start with UBI, Universal Basic Income, because I was privileged enough to have been exposed to the debates on UBI before you were born, in the mid-1980s. There was...
I was born then, I'm afraid.
There you are. So I wasn't in favor of the idea of UBI when it first surfaced as a kind of social democratic alternative to socialism. And I wasn't because the original idea, and quite a few people still believe that original idea, the original idea is that you give everybody £1,000 a month, let's say, without any conditions. That's why it's universal. I'm all in favor of that, by the way. Totally in favor of that. What I'm not in favor of, what I wasn't in favor of, was the idea that that would be funded through taxation. And the reason why I wasn't in favor of that is because I thought it would be quite divisive and toxic. Suppose in Sheffield you went to a blue-collar worker struggling to make ends meet, and you were to say to her or to him, I'm going to tax you so as to give £1,000 every month to rich people. to, people who don't want to work, to surfers, as we used to say in Australia, right? They would say, what? I'm already struggling to survive, and you're going to tax me to give money to people who don't need it or who don't deserve it. That's where the idea of the personal capital account in our central banks enters the scene, and then suddenly everything changes. Now, what I'm describing is a situation where after share markets have collapsed due to the one person, one share, one vote, and banks no longer can make money out of lending to speculators to play the stock exchange. Private banks have very little to do. Then they will have to simply collect your savings, if you have any, and try to lend them to somebody else who doesn't have any. Now, add to that scene a decision by the Bank of England, let's say. The Bank of England is to announce that every resident of the United Kingdom automatically, without even having to make an application, automatically is granted a digital bank account with a debit card that will be sent to them. It could be even digital. It could be an app on your phone that allows you to pay as you go. Then you have absolutely no reason to have a bank account with a private bank. What is the point? Unless the bank really goes out of its way to make it free for you and also to give you a loan that you wouldn't get otherwise. But suddenly, the vast majority of people would have no reason to have an account with a private bank. Now, if this means that people will migrate from the private banking sector to the digital accounts that the Bank of England grants them, and technically this can happen tomorrow. Well, let's say within a week. It really is really very simple for the Bank of England to give a bank account to every resident. They have the technology, they have the know-how. Digital platforms are now wonderfully efficient. They require very few staff to run them. Now, if all of us had our money with our central bank, then the whole payment system of the United Kingdom would be a spreadsheet, something like an Excel file, with that is owned by the Bank of England, and each one of you, each resident of the UK, would be one row of that spreadsheet, and you would have your money would be there, located there, and every time you paid Jack or Jill for whatever, a coffee that you bought from their coffee shop or a bicycle you bought from the bicycle shop, what would happen is numbers would migrate from your cell on the Excel file of the Bank of England to the cell of Jack or of Jill. Yeah? So the money would stay within the same Excel system. And then suddenly it becomes abundantly clear that there's no problem whatsoever for the Bank of England simply to write a little piece of code that adds 1,000, the number 1,000, to each cell every month. This is your basic income. And it doesn't come from taxation. To the extent that there is any excess capacity in the economy, that is, to the extent that people can actually do more things than what they are doing, either because they sell more bicycles, or because they have more time to produce recipes and put them out for sale or whatever, then there will be no inflation whatsoever, especially if you have unemployment, especially if you have underemployment, especially if you have people that would suddenly be liberated by this UBI to actually do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise, because today they will lose their part of their pension, or they will lose part of their unemployment benefit or whatever. So this is how the demise of the private banking system of the stock exchange, the facility of the personal capital account to each resident by the Bank of England, the central bank, and universal basic income come together to create a completely different setting that is completely different, is very radically different to what we have. But technically speaking, it could happen in a week.
Yeah, which is absolutely staggering to think of, right? you kind of in those two very simple on the surface, but very complex in their results, I think in some ways. You've completely transformed in The Other Now the way that the way that people live, the way that companies are owned. You've gotten rid of the banks, you've gotten rid of the stock exchange. One feature of capitalism that people recognize, however, that you have retained is markets in a different fashion. So I was wondering, can you just explain how markets work in The Other Now and why you chose to retain that aspect?
Oh, fantastic question. In The Other Now, I have effectively removed two markets. Two markets only have gone. One is the market for labor, because that is what makes capitalism capitalism. I mean, every society, since humanity started being humanity, featured markets. There were always things that were being sold and purchased, even under very primitive conditions. Certainly in ancient Rome, certainly in ancient Greece, certainly in the Middle Ages, there were markets all over the place. What made capitalism capitalism is the emergence of a market for labor. And that happened, of course, in Britain first with the enclosures. The moment the peasants were thrown off the land and replaced with sheep, because wool had become an international commodity, and the lord could actually sell the wool internationally and at a price that was internationally set. And the peasants were thrown out. And what did they do? They walked to the nearest village and they knocked on doors and said, I will do anything for a loaf of bread. That's the first labor market. Because before that, peasants worked, but their labor was not a commodity. They worked on the land of the lord. At the end of the season, the lord would send the sheriff and to collect the lord's share. This was not a market mechanism. It was coercion. It was a series of local customs that determined how much of the produce of the peasants the lord would collect. Then the lord would take the surplus and sell it in nearby markets or markets further afield. So there were markets, but they were not central to production. Production was happening outside the context of markets. So it is the labor market which is unique to capitalism. For the first time in human history, we had a labor market. Right after the enclosures, this was the beginning of capitalism, and it remains to this day. The idea that you are selling your labor time and your skills to an employer for a certain amount of money because you do not have access to means of production, that is what makes capitalism capitalism. So I did away with this market because otherwise I would not be writing a novel about post-capitalism, about what happens after capitalism. So this was the first market that I removed. The second market that I removed was, of course, the market for derivatives and shares. Because to end the labor contract, to end the labor market, I had to remove to eliminate the stock exchange, the market for private rights over means of production. The two go together. Private ownership of means of production, shares means a labor market. So talk about post-capitalism, to go beyond capitalism, you have to get rid of these markets. All the other markets stay. Now, what role do they play? They play a coordinating role, the same that Adam Smith referred to. You see, because when Adam Smith was talking and waxing lyrical, as I said before, about markets, he was saying that the beauty of the market is that it is an automated mechanism where nobody needs to make the decision of how much needs to be produced at what price. Because, that happens automatically. So if you and I and another 500 people have formed a company, and each one of us owns one share, and we effectively make collective decisions through voting, we may even elect our manager and so on, we still have to decide what do we produce, how much we produce, and at what price do we sell it. But that is not something we can decide on our own. That depends on what demand there is by the public out there for our produce. And that shapes through competition as well, because there will be others who have the same idea and form competing, I call them corporate syndicalist firms, corporations that are owned by their workers. And the market, therefore, plays the role of equilibrating prices and quantities throughout the market. Now, other socialists absolutely loathe this idea. They would attack me, and they have attacked me, and I think with good reason, for having maintained the market mechanism at the heart of my post-capitalist, socialist, democratic, socialist utopia. I can't see how it is possible to do that otherwise without degrees of authoritarianism that I can't live with. And let me explain that. What is the alternative to having a market? The alternative is to have, let's say, for instance, a kind of bureaucratic mechanism, either Soviet-like, where a central planning authority tells each company what to produce and at what price. We saw what happened in the Soviet Union with that. It simply accumulated inordinate amount of political power in the hands of a small nomenclatura. I don't want to live in that kind of regime. This is not my idea of freedom. And for me, socialism is all about freedom. It's not about justice. For me, Marx was a great apostle of liberation, of freedom, of liberty. And for me, capitalism is wrong and stupid, not because it is unjust, but because it is illiberal. And injustice is a repercussion, is a byproduct of the illiberty. So I don't want to trade capitalism for a centrally planned system. Is there an alternative? Yes. I was talking to Michael Albert, a fantastic comrade from the United States who has been working for decades on what he calls participatory economics. PARICON is the movement that he has been working for and with. He proposes an alternative to markets, which is producer-consumer councils, where producers and consumers in a certain vicinity get together and hammer out a collective plan of what needs to be produced, at what price, and who should get what, and then producers produce that which has been agreed, and then consumers consume it. For me, that sounds very elaborate, and also illiberal. Because what happens if you have a crank, a socialist Elon Musk, somebody who has a great idea, but it's so out there that everybody dismisses as stupid, but it isn't stupid. This person would simply suffocate if he had or she had to negotiate the possibility of trying out something new within a council. And this is where the liberal me comes out. So the market for me is a way of preserving liberalism within socialism, combining a post-capitalist, socialist, democratized economic sphere with a political sphere which is both democratic but also liberal. However, having said that, Sara, I've got my doubts. And in the novel, because you were kind enough to read it, you will have seen how my doubts surface. They surface through Iris. Iris is my hero in the book. Well, actually, they are all my heroes, but she's, I think, a bit closer to my heart, because she turns against the use of markets, and she argues fiercely that the socialists who created this other now effectively betrayed the cause by retaining those markets. This is why the novel allows me to disagree with myself. So I have Iris, taking down philosophically, morally, everything that I tried to create as, a market socialism. And we won't reveal the ending of the book, but the ending of the book tries to capture my own ambiguity and ambivalence regarding the reliance of markets. I mean, ideally, I would like to, I'm a Trekkie. I would like to live in a Star Trek society where we don't need markets, because, you have a hole in the wall, you have a replicator producing anything you want. And then we can all sit around, the cockpit, the bridge of USS Enterprise, exploring the universe and having philosophical conversations.
I mean, I'm entirely with you on that one. Abundance communism all the way for me. But realistically, we probably need a couple of stages in between. And it's great that you brought up Iris at the end of that. Iris was my hero throughout it. I really identified with a lot of her narrative and her conversation. And one thing that your characters and Iris wrestle with that I think links to some of the things that you were just talking about is around feminism and patriarchy. And I'm not going to presume what other people understand as feminism. I'm going to talk about what feminism is for me. But for me, feminism is an outright rejection of the power dynamic in patriarchy, in white supremacy, and in capitalism that sees power as something that is over another, whether that is through countries and military might, economic domination of large corporations, or between individuals. And feminism, for me, rejects that and sees power as with someone else, not over, something that can only be built and accumulated collaboratively. And I wonder where the other now sits in this characterization of power, and in retaining systems such as markets and exchange value. Do we risk perpetuating that power dynamic of power over others, which is ultimately a framework for oppression and therefore illiberal?
The very brief answer to your question is yes. This is why Iris is so adamant that, yes, the other now, as described in the book, is very decent. It's a major improvement on capitalism and techno-feudalism. She has a lot of respect for the people who fought for the transformation, the socio-economic transformation described in the other now, but at the same time, she remains a dissident against that other now because of the retention of markets, because her view, and clearly that's also my view, is that markets are based on the logic of exchange value and the triumph of exchange value over real life experiences, over real values, human values. So the moment you reduce the value of something to, what are you going to give me in the return of that? To price. You end up with Oscar Wilde's definition of cynicism, of he who knows everything about prices and nothing about values. And I fear that even a market socialist world, even though I think there is no alternative to having one before we get to the abundance communism of Star Trek, is really not going to change patriarchy. You see, I was very lucky, even though, I'm a member of the defective sex, and I'm quite old as well. And I grew up in a hugely patriarchal society, Greece of the 1960s and 70s. But I was very lucky to have a mother who was a feminist, who did what she turned into a feminist while I was growing up. She came from a very conservative background. But I also have a grandmother whom I've never met, and this is one of my great regrets, my father's mother, who was a suffragette in the 1920s, in, of all places, Cairo, Egypt. You can imagine. So what those women taught me, my grandmother through my father and through her writings, and my mother through her struggles, is how stupid the left was when they were saying that, forget the gender issues, let's have socialism and then everything will sort itself out. No, it won't. No, it bloody well won't. Because this is not about even women's issues. It's exactly as you said. It's all about power. And patriarchy is a system that breeds power and reproduces it in subtle ways and in ways that go well beyond the level of our conscious, deeply into our subconscious. And in a way, markets are male. They are patriarchal by definition. The idea that reciprocity based on exchange is the be-all of human relationships, is effectively a homage to patriarchal male power. The book contains another female character who was one of the leaders of the revolution in the Others Now. Her name is Esmeralda, as you will probably recall. And I used her in order to put into the book my dire concern that even a revolution of the kind that I imagined in my happiest of dreams, even such a revolution might very well be led by somebody like Esmeralda, a feminist, an inspiring figure and so on. But, you know, like Alexandra Kollontai or Rosa Luxemburg, she will be eaten up, chewed up, and spat out by the revolution that she leads, simply because for a revolution to succeed, you need power. And especially if you use this power to create a new market society, even a democratized one, it's very likely that it will end up being patriarchal and it will reject those who are genuinely feminists within it. So if you want, that is a pessimistic vignette within my novel. But I felt that I had to put it in there because I do not trust us men not to mess things up, even when things are going in the right direction.
Well, and you're right. It is the pessimistic vignette, but nevertheless, I'm very glad that you put it in there, because I think the only way we're going to be able to mitigate that replication of these power systems, and not just patriarchy, but also white supremacy, homophobia, is by talking about that slightly pessimistic side of it, because you can't fight what you can't see. But I am aware that I could talk to you about feminism and capitalism and the intersection all evening, and that would be remarkably self-indulgent of me. So I'm going to move us on to another thread that I'd quite like to pull out from the Other Now, which is around information and data. Total transparency is key to so many of the Other Now systems, from assigning of bonuses within a company to rent controls and land prices and using self-revelation mechanisms. And that sits alongside a rigorous level of controls for individuals over their personal data. And as you do investigate, that's a tricky line to walk. But what struck me is how far away that is from where we seem to be now. It's almost the polar opposite, in fact. And you thinking about, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I would have hoped that something like that would trigger our own digital renaissance, but it doesn't seem to have happened. And I'm just wondering how you see that developing in the next few years.
Oh, it's going to be bleak. This pandemic has weaponized the surveillance capitalism tremendously, and it couldn't happen any other way, because let's face it, people are scared. They're scared of the virus. They're scared of dying. So when the state or some company says to them, "I'm going to develop a platform where we'll be able to monitor the spread of the virus, and you will know if you walk in that direction as opposed to this direction, that the viral load in the vicinity is going to increase, so as to avoid it." People will say, "Yes, I want it. I want it." But it's a very short step from surveillance technology that monitors your coughs to one that monitors your reaction to the speeches of the great leader, that monitors your laughs, monitors the way you respond when you see an advertisement. So given that these days the real gold or the real oil of the economy is data that can be used by big tech to manipulate us, because this is what the whole point of social media is: manipulation. The only reason why Twitter exists, the only reason why Snapchat exists, the only reason why these apps exist. I mean, we like them. I use them. I'm sure you use them too, and they're great. But the reason why the people who actually create them have created them is because they allow people to talk to one another so as to be able to intervene behind the scenes and manipulate both of their behaviors, and to manipulate in the way that is profitable to them. So it's 1984 at a decentralized level. There's not one big brother. There are quite a few big brothers, and in the end, they work as a cartel of big brothers, and they harvest our data in a way that does two things at once. Firstly, it enriches them by making us buy things that we neither need nor want, and secondly, it allows the national security state and apparatus to be completely in control of our lives in a way that there must be some old KGB people, I mean, Putin is one of them, who are looking at what's happening in the West, and they're kicking themselves, thinking, by golly, we spent all that time back in the 1970s and 80s in East Germany with Stasi and Russia with, the KGB, trying to manipulate it to control the population. And, we were brutal, we tortured people and so on. It was all unnecessary. Look, in the West, they're doing it with just some digital platforms. So, but Sara, it goes beyond that. I had, as you know, the interesting, let's call it that, experience of having spent a few months inside the closed up rooms in which important decisions are being made on behalf of the many. The opacity was mind-boggling. The fact that nobody out there knows what their elected representatives are saying to one another and how decisions are. They don't even know the decisions that are being reached. It's actually even worse. The ministers themselves do not understand what decisions they're reaching, because they have been effectively pre-agreed by apparatchiks that live in the shadows, whom no one knows, not even the minister. And this is how our systems are being run. This is how big, huge decisions are being made. And the reason, the Boris Johnsons and Angela Merkels of the world, all they do, they're not really even in control of what's going on. They're out there to put a gloss on what has already been decided. To give an ex post rationalization of things they don't even understand, usually reading from briefing notes. So the opacity runs across the whole spectrum of decision making. From what movie am I going to watch tonight on Netflix, to the vaccine procurement policies of the European Union, to going to war, to which side of the civil war in Libya we're going to support, whom to bomb and whom not to bomb. All that is opaque, and of course it makes a complete a travesty of the idea of democracy. Because if people don't even know what is being discussed, there's no way the democratic process can ever be in control of that which is being done against the interests of the many, in the name of the many. So, the struggle for transparency is a struggle for survival, not just for democracy. It's a struggle for survival of our species. And this is why I have to say that, especially given that we are in Britain, at least you are in Britain, and I am, zooming in. Because, my friend Julian Assange, as we speak, is rotting in Belmarsh. Let's not forget why he's rotting in Belmarsh. Whatever you may think about him for a number of reasons, the reason is because with a very clear agenda, a very clear project and ideology, he set up WikiLeaks as a gigantic digital mirror, the purpose of which is to turn it towards the face of Big Brother or the cartel of Big Brothers, so that we know what they are thinking and what they are saying, to repay the compliment, so that they cannot go to sleep at night without fearing that we are going to be watching them watching us. And the fact that he revealed aspects of the ugly face of the cartel of Big Brothers is the reason why he's rotting in jail today.
And it's interesting to think about that transparency for me in terms of accountability. I mean, you talk about holding up a mirror, but I feel like we're in a crisis of accountability, and even the things that we do have. I mean, transparency is the wrong word; it's not transparent. But even the things that we do have knowledge of, it's in Britain. You know, the examples around cronyism and PPE contracts and straight up lies that have been told. Like, we know that's happened. We have that knowledge. But there doesn't appear to be a mechanism with which to hold them accountable with that knowledge. It feels like there's something slightly missing there. And that feeds into feelings of disenfranchisement and disconnection from politics and helplessness, which then only goes to cement the positions of those in power, kind of creating these feelings in the first place. So what's the second half of that? Where's the accountability from the transparency?
Oh, there is no accountability whatsoever. There can be no accountability because, you know, we live in one party states. There is one party. It's the property party, the party of the, you know, large-scale property owners, and it has two branches. You know, the Conservatives and the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. You know, for a very short period, this monopoly was close to being broken because Jeremy Corbyn was surreptitiously and serendipitously, for a very short time, elected leader of the Labour Party, but that anomaly has now been removed. And you have effectively you have a choice between two versions of exactly the same process. And this is how parliamentary democracy, especially in a country that relies on first past the post, which is designed to ensure that the extension of the franchise to the poor and to the women did not change the balance of power and the capacity of those in power to avoid any kind of accountability.
In an attempt to bring it back to something slightly more positive, one thing we have seen in the last year during this crisis is kind of new and varied forms of, I guess, radical municipalism, which seems to be on the rise in the UK. And that's been really interesting. In Sheffield, we're currently waiting for the result of a referendum on how our council is run, which we won't have the result for a few days, but that was triggered by the 2011 Localities Act. And we've seen the growth of mutual aid groups and that kind of community level organization. Like, what's your view on the growth of like neighborhood and city power over the last year or so, and what hopes do you hold for it, if any?
Oh, many. It's a serious source of hope. When people manage to get out of their homes, and we saw that now during the COVID-19 crisis, the solidarity amongst neighbors, the small acts of incredible generosity that flowed into a majestic river of solidarity across Britain, across the United States, across many parts of the world, a constant reminder that the logic of the market, the logic of I give, you take, the logic of, you know, Thatcher, that, you know, Thatcher's great triumph, as I keep saying, was that she made it almost impossible that for people to imagine that one can do something good for no reason, for the hell of it. That has come back, and it's coming back, and the municipality is the obvious locus of such activity because of proximity, because the scale problem is much more manageable, and people can actually feel that they are making a difference to their lives. So municipalism in Sheffield, in Manchester, in places like Barcelona, after the 2010 debt crisis and the foreclosures crisis and the evictions. Here in Greece, municipalism is a major threat to the status quo. And we need to work very hard, however, to combine municipalism with internationalism. Maybe bypass the national level and leave the national level for last. An alliance of what we in DiEM25 or Democracy in Europe movement have been working on. We call it rebel cities. An alliance between, let's say, Sheffield and Barcelona and Athens would be a wonderful way to bypass central national government authority, which is always the last bastion to fall, the last bastion of the oligarchy. And if we can extend that to cities in India, Latin America, Africa, and so on, that would be a wonderful way. And this is, I refer to DiEM25, with which I'm heavily involved, but also the Progressive International that 3 years ago, Bernie Sanders and I inaugurated in Vermont, and now is expanding across the world. Municipalism, radical rebel networks, and so on, is central to our strategy for fighting the fight.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the nation state as the last bastion, and I think that there was wonderful moments in the book of balancing, as you were just saying, the local and the international. And I think one of my favorite and most deliciously subversive things I think you put in there was the removal of the immigration political football from nation states and giving it to local municipal groups. That's absolutely wonderful. I'm really conscious that we're now at 8 o'clock and that I could go on for a really long time, but we have a lot of people in the audience and I'm sure they have a lot of questions. So our Festival of Debate team is working behind the scenes to collate your questions and send them to me, because there's been a lot going through the chat. Whilst that's happening, I've just got one hopefully nice fun question while we wait for those other questions to come through, which is, Yanis, if there was a door to the other now in your kitchen, would you walk through?
Oh my goodness. Well, it depends. Can I walk back? In the book, no such prospect is offered. So either you walk through it once and for all, or you don't walk at all. And that makes it an impossible choice. Look, I oscillate. I vacillate. One day I say I would, another day I say I wouldn't. I mean, I'm a true believer that happiness doesn't reside elsewhere. You've got to create it where you are. And you have to do this by, not taking things for granted, because there's nothing more boring in this life than taking the status quo for granted.
I could not agree with you more. Until we get Star Trek Abundance Communism, I will happily take that status quo for granted. So we've got some questions that have come through from our wonderful audience members, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us and contributing. So Sophie Renshaw asks, how do you understand the collective amnesia of people who have been affected by years of unnecessary austerity, which have decimated local services and culture, who are turning to right-wing parties?
I don't think it's amnesia. I think people understand exactly what's going on. I'm a true believer that even those who do things that I hate and I disagree with, they're not dumb. We should never demonize those who make choices that are even abhorrent to us. If you think about it, how did Nazism, fascism rise up in the 1920s and 30s? If you humiliate a people, if the so-called advocates of democracy effectively become stooges of the oligarchy that is driving people into the ground, and they even lecture them about the importance of suffering an austerity hit life, while they're laughing all the way to the bank, while celebrating themselves as the great liberal Democrats. If you, in that situation, when people feel that they have been treated like cattle that have lost their market value, a populist stands up on, a pedestal and looks at them in the eye and says, you hate those guys, don't you? Well, I hate them too. I'll make you proud again. Here's the deal. I'm going to look after you. I'm going to give you a minimum wage increase. I'm going to give you pension. Remember who introduced pensions? In Europe, it was not the Labour Party. It was Mussolini. And before that, it was Bismarck in Germany, right? It was the extreme right that did it. Looking after people on condition that they would not unionize, they would not ask for democratic rights, and they will be, they would do as they're told, and collectively hate the other, the gay, the Jew, the German, the Greek, doesn't matter, the foreigner. One of the great crimes of people like Hillary Clinton in the United States was to demonize those who supported Trump. Because I have no doubt, I've spoken to many of those people, Trump supporters, because I'm very interested in what these people think. Most of them were nice people, actually. Most of them. And it's not true that they were racist. A lot of them had voted for Obama in 2008. Let's not forget that. A lot of the people who voted for Obama in 2008 then voted for Trump. Many of them knew that Trump was a very sorry excuse for a human being. But they thought, okay, how can I annoy those who have destroyed my prospects in Washington? Who do I need to vote for to annoy them the most? Trump, I'll vote for him. There's no doubt in my view that in the north of England in particular, a lot of people voted Brexit, not because they cared about the European Union, whether Britain was in the European Union or not, but because, the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, Barack Obama, Osborne, Cameron, were saying to them, don't you dare vote for Brexit. I would be tempted to vote for Brexit if I had this panoply of the so-called, liberal establishment warning me that if I didn't vote for Remain or for Clinton, then Armageddon will come. A lot of people said, let it come. What the people in Financial Times, I was telling some of the Financial Times journalists, every time they came out with one of those predictions that 20% of GDP is going to be lost, they didn't understand that this was actually serving not the interests, but it was actually adding to the blitz mentality of those who said, my life is absolutely dismal. You know what? I want to see a reduction of GDP by 20%. My GDP has not gone up at all. I don't have any GDP. I'm starving. I cannot make ends meet. I want your GDP to fall. So you're predicting that 20% of the GDP, I'm going to vote for it. This is how fascism takes root. When people lose hope, okay, then the dark side comes out. So the question is, whom do we blame? Whom do we blame? I'll answer that question, because it was a rhetorical question. I blame us, the left, because we have failed these people. We, the left, were supposed to give them hope. We haven't. We failed. And we have a duty, a moral duty, to treat them with respect, even when they vote for Boris Johnson, for Nigel Farage, for Donald Trump, and so on.
Thank you. That's really powerful. So the next question is from Food Hall. From memory, brackets, I read it a while ago, you don't discuss state power and the enforcement of borders and state policing. I wonder if there is anything you could say about this and the interactions this has with the economic discussion within the book.
Call me, a super optimist, naive, but I truly believe that wars take place, especially today, as an extension of class wars. Look at the invasion of Iraq. It didn't happen for any other reason, but because Dick Cheney wanted the oil. If oil companies did not belong to shareholders, and if we had a Green New Deal that did away with oil exploration, there would be no invasion of Iraq. Look today at the way in which the liberal establishment in Europe, in the UK, and especially in the United States, is portraying the clash between China and the United States. I'm very fearful of a possible episode between the United States and China, because you can see that Biden, despite the surprisingly progressive tone that he has adopted in domestic politics with his stimulus plan and so on, when it comes to foreign policy, he's totally Trumpian when it comes to China. Effectively the fueling of a new Cold War with China, which can become a hot war with China. Now, what is this whole thing about? What are the American workers being told by Trump and by Biden? Same story. The story is that the Chinese are taking your jobs. All the jobs are migrating to China, and the American working class is losing out, and the Chinese must be stopped because they are usurping our industries. This is what both Biden and Trump are saying. This is, of course, rubbish. I mean, these trade wars are hidden class wars. What is happening is both countries, economic blocs, China and the United States, they are slightly different models, but they are both based on private ownership of firms. What happens is the developmental models of China and the United States are based on constantly shifting money, resources, from the working class to the elites, both in China and in the United States. And because of the different monetary systems, it is in the interest of the elites, both in China and the United States, for iPhones to be produced in China, right? It's not that China imposed upon the United States that the iPhone should be made in Shenzhen, right? And the portion of Chinese income going to the working class in China is shrinking. It is extremely low. In the United States, what happens, because they are constantly in deficit, the only way the working class can get ahead is by getting more loans from Wall Street, becoming more debt bonded to the financial capital. And who is benefiting from this? Both the elites in China and the elites in the United States. So if you do away with what is at the foundation of this trade war, which is concentrated ownership of means of production in both countries, then you do away with all the reasons for confrontation between the United States and China. As for refugees and migrants, look, I have a very radical view on that, I'm a politician. By the way, I'm no longer a professor of economics, I still have this title, but I'm leading a political party in Greece's parliament. And I can tell you that what I'm telling you now is what I say in there and what I say out on the hustings. And it's politically very difficult. The political cost is huge. And what is it that I'm saying? That borders are a scar on the face of the earth, and we need to do away with them. It is a pathetic idea that we have a line on the border and we have, a border fence that is electrified and people cannot cross. I mean, what gives us the right to do this? I mean, we're just a stupid animal on this planet. And suddenly we have carved it up that way. Humanity is based on constant human movement. From the beginning, our beginnings, we all started life in Africa and we spread out. We conquered, like a virus, we conquered the world, right? For 1,000 years, Europeans have been sending people to the other continents, usually as colonialists, right? But that migration was fine. Now, all that's happening is that Europe is getting old, demographics, and the flow has been reversed. People are coming into Europe. Let them come. We need them. We're getting old and decrepit. And the idea that we are going to shoot them at the border, or what we are doing now here in Greece, under the auspices of the European Union, which is we are violating international law and we're pushing those boats full of hapless, desperate people, and we're pushing them back into the stormy seas and abandoning them there without food, water, or any means of communicating. A lot of them drown. The other day we had a report that 2,000 people drowned in our seas because they were being pushed back. These are crimes against humanity for no reason whatsoever. I do believe that, we should simply open the borders. Just open the borders. I know it sounds like political suicide to say this. And it has had political costs on our party, Mera 25, but we don't care.
Well, it may cause you some difficulty politically, but I think it will also win you a lot of friends. Well, for my part, as much as my opinion matters for anything, there's no other logical or human answer. Janet asks, it's one thing to come up with a utopian vision of what can replace capitalism, commendable that might be, but the more formidable challenge is how to get from here to there in order to implement and maintain such an idea and prevent it from being destroyed by authoritarian tendencies. Can you address this?
I try to address it in a chapter because in the book, as you know, I try to do two things. Firstly, to describe the kind of democratized economy and society of the other now, and also to write the hardest chapter to write was one entitled "How Capitalism Died," which was, my account of the rebellion of the revolution that led to the demise of capitalism. So I'm not going to repeat what is in that chapter, but it is clear to me that that's of course the pertinent question. How do we go from here to there? I tried. I did my best in that chapter to describe, in the context of the period between 2008, when capitalism had its second spasm. The first one was in 1929. The second one was in 2008. How we could have, instead of just gathering around squares and doing Occupy, the city or Occupy Wall Street, what could we have done to bring about the transformation? So I did, to the best of my ability, I tried to tell a story of what that could be. But then there's another question that I was just asked, which is crucial. And how do we maintain the principles of the revolution? Because this is how revolutions usually end up. Even when they were successful, like the French Revolution, like the Russian Revolution, they ended up eating their children and ending up, in a bloodbath of authoritarian bigotry. So the answer to that question, I think, is twofold. One is philosophical, the first fold of the answer. We must constantly remind ourselves that we have a dark side in us. We must never allow ourselves to become too enamored of our own actions, of our own contribution. We must always remain vigilant and understand that the darkness is within us. That's why at the beginning of the book, Iris is buried in a black and red coffin. The red representing the fiery revolutionary spirit, and the black representing the darkness that she always said to her friends resides within each one of us. The second one is more tangible. We need we need democratic processes, and in particular, democratic processes in the ancient Athenian tradition, because as I keep reminding people, in ancient Athens, the major clash was between the democrats and the oligarchs, or the aristocrats. The aristocrats loved elections, and the democrats were against elections. And the reason why the aristocrats loved elections was because they controlled them. If you have money, you can buy them. You can, even if you do it indirectly, you have the better teachers of rhetoric to teach you how to present oligarchic views as universal principles. Whereas the Democrats believed in sortition. They believed in the jury system, in even the judges in ancient Athens. For the short period of time when democracy, male democracy, but there was an interesting democratic experiment. Even judges were selected by through lotteries. So we believe, and this is one of the policies of our party here in Greece, Mera 25, we are advocating citizens' assemblies, citizens' councils making decisions on almost everything, from education to the way the NHS is run. Councils that comprise 2/3 jurists, people selected through lotteries, and 1/3 elected. We need some elected people, but they should be in a minority. Those who win elections should be in a minority. That is how you safeguard against authoritarianism after the revolution succeeds.
Thank you for that. So Lucy asks, you mentioned you're against a centrally planned regime. I just wondered what your thoughts are on blockchains, distributed ledger technology, and the idea of the sharing economy.
Well, blockchain, Bitcoin has nothing to do with the sharing economy. That's a completely different issue. But when I first read the algorithms connected to Bitcoin, this was back in 2010. I remember I gave an interview and I was asked what I thought of it, and I said Bitcoin is a fantastic solution to a problem we have not discovered yet. By that I meant that it's not a currency and it should never be a currency. Because, you know, as a currency, it was simply trying to replace the gold standard. And the gold standard is an awful mechanism, which is guaranteed to create huge recessions and therefore give immense power to the oligarchy, for reasons that John Maynard Keynes explained very well. But the algorithm, the distributed ledger algorithm on which Bitcoin was based, fascinated me because it was a genuinely decentralized system that allowed you to combine, on the one hand, a record of transactions or a record of moves or things that people do that is central, which is transparent, and combine that with anonymity and without anyone controlling it, but being community-based. So, for instance, you know, when it comes to contracts between companies and so on, the blockchain can be a very useful tool within a democratized market society, but it will never replace a currency. Money needs to remain political. And of course, it needs to be democratized, but Bitcoin does not democratize it. What it does is it takes it away from the political process. This is the dangerous fantasy of apolitical money. Money has to remain political, but not oligarchic. So how do you combine democratizing money while keeping it political and not, you know, recreating a digital version of the gold standard? Well, the answer is the system that we discussed before, where the central bank gives each one of us a bank account, and then the numbers that appear on our bank account that's digital money provided by the central bank. And if we want to ensure that the central bankers are completely subject to our collective surveillance, we survey them, not them us, then we can introduce a blockchain mechanism to ensure that everybody, every citizen, can see exactly how much money exists in that system while preserving anonymity. And that's where blockchain comes in, but not Bitcoin. We take blockchain away from Bitcoin and we put it place it in the service of our political money.
Interesting. Okay. Michael says, thanks, Yanis, for writing. I much enjoyed it. Is it the case that to realize the objectives of Progressive International, we'll need global grassroots solidarity? And if that is so, and given the diversity and complexity of our world, how could that global grassroots solidarity be achieved?
The answer is a big neon light appearing yes. And how do we bring it about? Well, through a combination of global campaigns with a local focus. Let me give you an example. Suppose that there is a strike happening in Sheffield by nurses in a hospital or in a hospice in somewhere. And imagine that we organized an international campaign in their support. That's what I mean by global action with a local focus. Back in December, on what the Americans call Black Friday, and I know now the Brits also call it Black Friday. You get, as we say, shit spreads. So during Black Friday, the Progressive International, since you asked about the Progressive International, we organized a global campaign against Amazon, which we called Make Amazon Pay. And that involved a coalition of trade unions and organizations whose membership reached 200 million people. And it was absolutely wonderful to see in one day a rolling strike that started in Bangladesh, in warehouses of Amazon in Bangladesh, then spread to India. Then after that, it moved on to Amazon warehouses in Germany, from there to New Jersey in the United States, and from New Jersey to the West Coast in Washington State. We had projections of Make Amazon Pay logos on the house of Jeff Bezos, on Amazon's headquarters in Seattle, in Bangladesh. That is an example of a grassroots global campaign that actually supports communities and supports trade unions and workers in particular places. The combination of the global campaign with the local focus.
Thank you. I'm really aware we've only got about 5 minutes left, but I'll just squeeze one more question in, if that's okay with you, Yanis. We've had so many, and I'm so sorry to all of our audience members who we haven't been able to ask their questions. So final question, how essential is a system of global governance to solving global problems?
Goes without saying. Climate change is, of course, the obvious example. We can never deal with climate change if we don't act globally and if we are not coordinated. But it's not just climate change. Look at the pandemic. It's impossible to say, okay, we solved the pandemic in Britain. To hell with India. It's not to hell with India, because even if you don't give a damn about India, which of course you should, the mutations in India will come and bite you in Sheffield. So that's another example. But even strictly speaking on economic terms, you cannot solve private debt problems in Britain without solving them in France or in the United States. It's really not possible to free people of private debt bondage in one country and not in another, when banks operate globally and where monetary and banking policies are imposed by an ironclad global oligarchy. So in the same way that we need to take the fight against climate change to the global level, we need to take the fight for liberating people from private debt, liberating governments and polities from public debt, dealing with poverty. You cannot deal with poverty in one country when there is poverty growing and depravity and the precariat taking over the world everywhere else. So and the tragedy is this, but we can correct it. Tragedy in the ancient Greek sense, which has a catharsis at the end. In that sense, I mean it as a tragedy. The tragedy is that the bankers and the fascists know this, and they are remarkable at organizing globally and showing immense solidarity across national borders. When you go to Davos, not that I've been or that I ever will go, but I imagine that if you go to Davos, or the people tell me who have been, they sit around the table, they're bankers from Britain, from Germany, from Nigeria, from Japan, from China, and they're buddies. They have absolutely there's no racism amongst themselves. They're bankers above all else. They have a class solidarity, which is impressive. Okay, so they act globally. Same with fascists. When Donald Trump and Nigel Farage get together, they have a party. Bolsonaro, Modi, Salvini, Le Pen, Orban, they get together. They are this kind of brotherhood and sisterhood of fascists. If only we progressives could emulate it. We need to emulate it.
So one big global progressive party.
Yep, that's what we're trying to do with Progressive International.
Well, I think that is a fabulous and hopeful note to end on. I want to say a massive thank you to everybody who's participated and the Festival of Debate team. Yanis Varoufakis, it has been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to chat to you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
The pleasure is all mine and the privilege. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, everyone. Solidarity. Hope to see you in Sheffield next time.
And hopefully we will see you in person again soon. The festival does run for about another month. Please do have a look at festivalofdebate.com to see what other exciting events we have coming up. And we are relying on audience donations. So if you are in the position of being able to donate, you can also donate on the website. Once again, thank you so much, everybody. And until we meet again, take care, stay safe, and keep hopeful.